Hello, I'm doing a review for this book. It's Empty Cradles by Margaret Humphreys. So I saw the film Oranges and Sunshine about a year ago. That's the film of this book, and it documents Margaret Humphreys' discovery of the child migrant schemes which sent thousands of British children abroad to grow up without their families in Commonwealth countries. The film and the book focus on children sent to Australia, and I will do the same in this review. Most of the children sent to Australia were sent away without their parents' permission or even their parents' knowledge. Many of the children were unhappy in Australia. Many were incorrectly told they were orphans. Many were used as cheap labour by the religious groups whose care they were under. Many of them grew up feeling lost and unwanted as they struggled to adjust to an unloved life in a country so far from their home. Some were sexually abused. In this excellently written book, Margaret Humphreys, a Nottingham social worker, explains her journey which led to her uncovering this scandal which was being stubbornly covered up and ignored. In late 1986, Humphreys received a letter from Madeleine. Madeleine had heard about a group that Humphreys ran supporting people who were involved in adoption, as birth parents, adoptive parents, or adults who had been adopted when they were children. Madeleine told Humphreys, "I was 4 years old when I left England," she wrote. "I was living in a children's home because my parents were dead, and was put on a boat with other children and sent to Australia. I don't even know if my name or birth date are right. All I know for certain is that I once lived in Nottingham." Initially, Humphreys thought that Madeleine must be mistaken because she could not see how it would have been possible for a 4-year-old to have been sent alone 12,000 miles across the world. Not long after Humphreys began this correspondence, an amazing coincidence occurred. Another woman, Marie, who attended the adoption group run by Humphreys, mentioned that years before she had found her brother and that he had been put on a boat to Australia when he was a child. These similarities of experience gave Humphreys the impetus to investigate further. Humphreys wanted to know if more children had been sent abroad. None of the social services departments or professional associations could help me, so finally I rang the Home Office and asked about the records of British children sent overseas in the 40s. After being cut off twice and put on hold for an eternity, an information officer told me he had no idea what I was talking about. That's the good old trustworthy UK government. Humphreys was unable to find anyone who could give her information about children being sent to Australia, and she needed more resources to be able to investigate it herself. She applied to trusts and associations for help, but was turned away. Eventually, Humphreys was advised to speak to a journalist who suggested placing an ad in an Australian newspaper asking for people to come forward. Humphreys received around a dozen responses to her Australian advert, and the newspaper paid for her and a reporter to go out to Australia to interview them. When the newspaper printed the story of the child migrants, Humphreys received inquiries by the sackload of people looking for their families. Humphreys' employers gave her a 2-year secondment so that she could devote her time to this cause, which was proving itself to be both massive and urgent. I knew the charities and orphanages must have kept files on individual children, and these would contain precious details about who placed the child in care, the names and addresses of parents or guardians, birth dates and correspondence. The major charities had shown no interest in opening up their archives to someone who had revealed their past activities in such an unfavourable light. I had also interviewed several child migrants who had requested access to their files, and either this had been denied or they had been told such information no longer existed or had never been kept. Humphreys set up the Child Migrants Trust and received donations that allowed her to get more help in finding information for the child migrants. There was interest in making a documentary or a drama about the child migrants. Humphreys was concerned that the issue needed to be handled sensitively and decided to work closely with the production teams. These enterprises brought in much-needed funds and allowed more trips to Australia to interview and support child migrants. The next time Humphreys was in Australia, there was more publicity and they were overwhelmed with child migrants looking for help. Similar stories emerged from the child migrants interviewed by Humphreys. Many of them were told their parents had died. Many of them did not receive loving contact in the children's homes. Many were lonely and did not understand why they had been sent away from the UK. Many had to work hard in the children's homes, sometimes cleaning, sometimes construction. Children wet the bed out of natural fear and were left in it. Some children were beaten, some were abused. All the children were lost. Many grew into adults who struggled to deal with their childhoods. Many found it difficult to connect to others emotionally, and many felt ashamed. Many had a desperate and unsatisfied need to find some family. Many longed for their mothers. Over and over again, people asked, "Do you think I've got any family? And also, what did I do wrong?" Fully grown adults who have carried these questions in their hearts since they were children. How incredibly sad. Opening up to Humphreys was an emotional and difficult journey for the child migrants. They were dealing with things they'd been battling with all their lives, feelings of abandonment, shame, fear and loss. Humphreys would have a long talk with them. Using her counselling skills, she would gently let them speak about their childhood and try to gather as many personal details as she could. Back in England, the first thing Humphreys did for many of the child migrants was to try and find their birth certificate. This was in the days before the internet, so it meant Humphreys travelling down to London and trawling through registers and ordering copies of certificates until she found the right one. It's a slow and laborious process and can fail to yield answers. Humphreys describes this process very well and communicates the unpredictability of each search. From their birth certificate, Humphreys could look further into their parents' lives, including marriages, deaths and potential addresses. She also visited relevant places and took photos to send to them. Humphreys understood how important it was to give people roots. One particularly difficult search was for the parents of Marie, who spoke to her in the beginning at the adoption group, and her brother in Australia, Harold. Marie had found her brother through the Salvation Army, who had been involved in her adoption, but between them they had been unable to find any more of their family. When Humphreys went to Australia, she met and interviewed Harold. He'd had a particularly difficult life and was disturbed by his upbringing. "The only woman I have wanted to find, desperately wanted to find, the one I have always wanted to hold me and hug me, is my mother. The emptiness has been with me all my life." Humphreys and Harold became close as he travelled to England to help search for his family, and Humphreys met up with him on future trips to Australia. It was a long and difficult journey to find information about Marie and Harold's parents, with many setbacks and dead ends. Harold found this particularly frustrating. Humphreys comments, "He wasn't sent abroad by a charity, he was sent by East Sussex County Council. He was in local authority care and ultimately the responsibility of the British government. So much so that the Home Secretary had personally to give his consent before Harold could be sent overseas. This bureaucratic chain of command meant that something had to have been written down. It was policy, not accident. So where were the files? Where was the Home Secretary's report? East Sussex County Council had no details of Harold or his parents, and the Department of Health continued to maintain that it had no records. That's your caring UK government again. Humphreys went to incredible lengths to track down Harold and Marie's mother. She managed to track down a neighbour who had known their parents when they were children. She could give no reason as to why they would have ended up in care. She knew them as loving parents, and their mother being particularly devoted. When Humphreys did finally trace their mother, she was no longer alive, and it seems that she believed her son had died. Some parents were told that their children had died, when in fact they had been sent to Australia. Another tragic case was Michael, who Humphreys helped. They met in Australia, and later he visited England, by which time Humphreys had been able to find out more information. Unfortunately, it wasn't good news. I knew that Michael's mother had been dead for more than 30 years, but for him she would die that day. The moment the death certificate passed from my hands to his, all Michael's hopes would be lost forever. Sadly, I had also discovered that Michael's mother had returned to the children's home looking for him. She went to collect him only to be told that he had been sent to Australia. Michael was devastated. He imagined that his mother had led a lonely life as she had not married, and he felt that he should have been with her. There were also beautiful and heartwarming reunions. How lucky these people were to get to see their parents again. It struck me really hard when Humphreys went to speak to women who had put their babies into care or up for adoption decades before. Humphreys is a very gentle woman, and as she broached the subject, these women knew straight away that it was about their babies. Some thought she was their daughter sitting in front of them. Could anything break your heart more? These women had been waiting 30, 40 or more years, hoping all the time to see their children again. In this quote, Humphreys was trying to trace Madeleine's mother and had found the address of her named godmother, who she then visited. Humphreys made some brief introductions. She stared at me intensely and finally said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "Are you my daughter?" Her face crumpled as I told her as gently as possible that I was sorry, but I didn't know her daughter. Both Madeleine's mother and her godmother had been single mothers. They struggled financially and also from the social stigma. She told Humphreys, "We wanted to keep our babies, but it just wasn't possible. We did what we thought was best for them." This woman had never told her husband about her baby. This is not uncommon. When Humphreys found Madeleine's mother, again, she didn't need to explain who she was. The elderly lady opened her front door. There was a brief moment when we both simply looked at each other. I was wondering whether to be formal or informal with her, but didn't get the chance. Before I could say a word, she said quietly, "I know why you're here. You're here about my baby." A woman in her 70s, still waiting for news on her baby. Madeleine's mother wanted to know, did her new family treat her well? Did they love her? When Humphreys told her that, unfortunately, for some reason, her daughter had grown up in a children's home in Australia, she was understandably very upset. Some of the children's homes were worse than others. Each day was similar to the last. Stories of cruelty and abuse now filled dozens of notebooks, and the pain and misery were relentless. Time and again the name Bindoon was spoken, with a mixture of anger and sadness. Every ounce of self-esteem and self-confidence had been taken or beaten from the boys who went there. They felt nothing. The most repeated line in all the interviews was, "I'm nobody." Bindoon was a boys' children's home run by a church organisation. There were many stories of cruelty, including violence and child abuse, as well as neglect and starvation. Shockingly, the children were used as labour to build large church buildings. Vulnerable children, with no shoes, working on a building site in the middle of nowhere in the burning heat. Children who were beaten and abused, with nobody to look after them and love them. Over and over people said to me, "We've been waiting for you all our lives. Where have you been?" Some of them were angry and questioned Humphreys. "What were you lot doing while we were being abused? What were you doing when we were working like slaves?" A documentary and a TV drama followed, each causing a huge reaction. Humphreys fought hard to get phone lines active to take calls from the many people who wanted to ring in following the screenings. The BBC was shockingly unsupportive of this. Humphreys began receiving anonymous secret documents which showed that the religious groups had pushed for the child migration schemes. The schemes were publicised as giving a better life to British orphans. Donations were even collected. Yet after researching thousands of cases in the past 7 years, I can safely say that I have found only one child migrant who could properly be called an orphan. They also showed that the poor treatment of children was known to the authorities. Concerns were raised in the UK and Australia. Damning reports were made of the conditions in the isolated church communities that were supposed to be looking after children. But still the ships left England carrying more and more children. Why didn't these people do their fucking jobs and put an end to this? Think how many children could have been spared these experiences if these people had done their jobs properly. The stories of abuse that happened in these communities are depraved and disgusting and unforgivable. Not only did this happen, but the red flags were ignored, the policy was pursued, and then the whole thing was covered up. Records were not even released to allow people to trace their families. However misguided the charities, organisations and governments may have been in their original plans, however people like to cling to the notion of incompetence from these highly educated people, there can surely be no excuse for the lack of cooperation when Humphreys was desperately trying to find personal details for the child migrants and to reunite them with their families while there was still time. The Australian government organisations and charities were much more helpful than the British, although some remained stubbornly resolute to take no responsibility for the mistakes that had been made or to cooperate in reuniting families. But other people were offering to help and work for free or as close to help the Child Migrant Trust, and donations kept coming in, some very generous, which allowed the team to keep working to help people find their history and their families. Humphreys was awarded the Order of Australia Medal for her services to the child migrants and the community at large. Humphreys went through a difficult emotional journey as she coped with what she was uncovering. She also had to deal with death threats against her and her family. This took its toll on her physically as well as mentally, but she ploughed on, determined to stand up for the child migrants, and they in turn showed her a lot of love and support. Humphreys' whole family ended up committing their lives to helping the child migrants. Her children sacrificed much of their precious time with their mother, and her husband was instrumental in her search for information about the origins of the child migrant schemes. He managed to find historical documents relating to the schemes and the charities that were involved in them. By now, Merv had discovered that the child migration schemes involved virtually all the major childcare agencies and charities in the UK, and a variety of social welfare agencies operating under different churches. Other groups, such as the NSPCC, were involved in a more limited way. How did this happen? On one side, you had single women or poor families who put their children into care, often not because it was what they wanted, but because of the huge social pressure. Sometimes it was only supposed to be temporary. On the other side, you had governments, charities and organisations, motivated in part by misguided ideas of philanthropy, but also strongly influenced by monetary forces and, at times, power. Why was the British government sending children who were in their care abroad? To reduce the cost of looking after them in the UK. Why did Australia want the children? Because they had a low population problem and they were worried about this problem being satisfied from their neighbouring countries. Why were charities operating these migrations? Money and free labour. The bond between a mother and her child is incomparable. I understand that some women truly don't want it when they have their baby, but for most women and their children, the connection is something words struggle to infer. It is so important for both parties, and I feel furious that people would think they could interfere with it, tamper with it, and sever it. I know that it wasn't just children in Britain who were separated from their parents. It happened all over the empire, and it was always wrong. The emotion caused in me when I read of the desperation for each other from the children and the parents who had been separated forces me to think that this is a crime against them, and it should never have happened. They should never have been pushed into these situations. Many of these parents would not have given their children away, temporarily or permanently, if it were not for the social stigma or for the situation of poverty that left them unable to support themselves, whether this was single mothers or poor families going through a tough time. These children were treated as a commodity to be moved to wherever it suited the people whose care they were in, governments, charities and organisations. Some were selling children, some were buying children, some were using children as free labour. I cried more reading this book than anything else I've ever read. Many of the stories referenced are heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. I was tearing up just reading the introduction pages before the main book. However, considering the subject matter, that's just as it should be. Humphreys has a lovely, gentle, warm writing style with a hint of humour. She comes across as both professional and compassionate. I can't imagine what it was like for Humphreys to write this book. I have cried all the way through it, and she is a woman who understands the gravity of these situations. It must have been a very painful process. The book is beautifully written, and that makes the subject matter bearable. Humphreys manages to tell her story and explain the lengths she went to help the child migrants, and also the amount of resistance she came up against from the authorities. During the book, she keeps her sense of surprise and shock and frustration that she felt along the way, so you feel like you are on the journey with her. Reading this book, I kept thinking charities, governments and organisations. These were the people who instigated and ran these activities, and then they covered it up. Charities, governments and organisations. They are not to be trusted, certainly not with your kids. Okay, here it is again. And the next book I'm reading is Virus Mania. Ooh, controversial. Okay, so look out for that. Thank you.